Hey guys, tonight let's go somewhere a little grim, but calm. Go ahead and turn off the lights, get comfortable, maybe fluff that pillow just one more time. Because tonight, we're going to talk about something that was anything but comfortable. We're going to drift back into the 1860s, to the American Civil War. Now don't worry, this isn't going to be an action-packed, cannon-blasting epic. This is bedtime, and bedtime history is best served lukewarm. We'll be moving slowly from campfires to muddy boots to the not-so-glorious truth of what it was actually like to fight in the Civil War. Spoiler alert, it wasn't great. So let's start at the beginning. What was it really like to sign up for the war? Well, if you were a young man in 1861, there's a good chance you thought it would be fun, romantic, even. The posters made it look like a camping trip with muskets, adventure, brotherhood, some new clothes, maybe a chance to impress the neighbor's daughter. Except those new uniforms, they usually didn't fit, they were itchy, and the colors faded fast because the Union bought from contractors who cut every corner possible. One soldier complained that after the first rain, his bright blue trousers turned into a kind of swamp gray. Perfect camouflage if you were lying down in a mud puddle. And food, well, food was food. The standard ration was hardtack, which sounds like something artisanal hipster bakers would charge $12 for today. But it was really just a hard square biscuit made of flour and water. No salt, no yeast, baked until it could probably survive a nuclear blast. Soldiers joked that you could break your teeth on it, and often you actually did. The army had to issue coffee not so much to wake men up, but to soften the biscuits enough so they wouldn't chip a molar. Let's drift off to the camps themselves. Civil War camps were little cities of mud. If you imagine tents neatly lined up, with soldiers singing patriotic songs around warm fires, well, sometimes, but more often, you had overcrowding, smoke, fleas, and the sweet smell of what happens when thousands of men live together without proper sanitation. Spoiler again, it wasn't lavender. Disease spread faster than bullets. Measles, dysentery, malaria, smallpox, you name it. A soldier had a better chance of dying from diarrhea than from a bullet wound, and soldiers knew it. They joked about it. Gallows humor. One diary entry said, "We are fighting the Confederacy, but I fear we are losing to our bowels." Charming bedtime material. And then there was boredom. Endless, dragging boredom, days without action. Soldiers played cards, carved wooden trinkets, and wrote letters home. And they complained a lot. If Reddit had existed in 1862, Civil War soldiers would have been power posters. Non-stop rants about the food, the weather, the officers. Imagine it, today's beef ration was green again. Send coffee, send socks, send literally anything that isn't hardtack. But what about the actual fighting? That's the thing, fighting in the Civil War was not constant. You could spend months in camp without ever seeing battle. And then, suddenly, you were shoved into chaos. Picture it, you're standing in a line shoulder to shoulder with 100 other men. Muskets ready, the officer yells, you march forward, there's smoke. Lots of smoke, muskets fire, cannons roar, you can't see more than a few feet ahead. And you just keep walking, because that's the tactic. March in a straight line toward the other guys who are also marching in a straight line. It sounds absurd now, but back then that was civilized warfare. It wasn't about ducking behind cover. It was about discipline, about not breaking ranks. If you flinched, if you ran, the line collapsed. So you stayed in formation. You reloaded your musket, standing in plain view. 10, 15, maybe 20 seconds, which feels like a year when someone is aiming at you. And of course, muskets weren't that accurate. A lot of shots just hit dirt. But when they did hit, the new rifled muskets tore through bone like it was paper. Amputations became the #1 surgery of the war. If you got hit in the arm or leg, you were probably losing it. Not because surgeons were cruel, but because there was no other option. Infection was inevitable. Let's slow down here and talk about surgeons. If you think Civil War medicine was advanced, let me burst that bubble gently. It was. Anesthesia existed, yes, chloroform and ether, but sometimes there wasn't enough. Sometimes there wasn't time, and surgery was fast, really fast. A skilled surgeon could saw off a limb in under 3 minutes. Efficiency was everything. Sterilization was. Doctors didn't wash their hands between patients. Why would they? Germ theory wasn't widely accepted. Instruments were wiped on whatever cloth was nearby, sometimes a bloody apron, sometimes nothing, which meant infections spread like wildfire. If you survived the bullet, you still had to survive the hospital. A lot of men didn't. And what about after surgery? You lay in a tent, maybe outside, maybe in a barn, flies buzzing, wounds packed with lint or rags, the smell of gangrene thick in the air. The word hospital was more suggestion than comfort. But it wasn't all doom. There were moments of strange humanity. Soldiers on both sides sometimes traded coffee and tobacco during truces. They shouted jokes across battle lines. They sang songs. They even met in no man's land to exchange newspapers. Because, why not? The enemy was just another farm boy, just as miserable as you. And there were pets. Yes. Soldiers adopted stray dogs, cats, even raccoons, mascots for regiments. One Union regiment marched with a live eagle named Old Abe. He survived dozens of battles, screaming over the gunfire, probably wondering why humans were so ridiculous. So what was it actually like to fight in the Civil War? It was boring, it was filthy, it was terrifying in short bursts, and it was deeply, deeply human. Not the glorious adventure the posters promised, not the noble sacrifice the speeches claimed. Just mud, smoke, biscuits hard enough to break a tooth, and the quiet knowledge that death was always a little too close. All right, that's enough for our first drift into this war. Let's pause here, and in part 2, we'll move deeper into daily routines, strange soldier superstitions, the letters that kept them sane, and the bizarre personal habits of the generals who led them. Good night, and let's pick this up again soon. If you're still awake, congratulations. That means the Civil War wasn't quite boring enough yet, but don't worry, it gets worse. So let's drift a little further. Let's wander into a typical day for a Civil War soldier. Mornings in camp were not peaceful. Forget the romantic idea of bugle calls floating across a misty field. The reality was more like, wake up now or a sergeant will kick you. Soldiers rose early, they cleaned muskets, they stood in roll call, often in the rain, while officers squabbled over numbers. Then came drill. Endless repetitive drill, marching back and forth, turning left, turning right, loading and unloading weapons, and then doing it again and again, because officers believed that drilling created discipline and discipline kept men alive in battle. Soldiers believed it created sore feet and boredom. When not drilling, there was fatigue duty, which sounds exhausting and was. Digging ditches, hauling water, chopping firewood, building fortifications, cleaning latrines, the glamorous side of soldiering. Now meals, breakfast was usually coffee, always coffee and hardtack, maybe salted pork if you were lucky. Soldiers got very creative with hardtack. They fried it in bacon grease. They crushed it and boiled it into a kind of mush called skilligalee. Some carved it into playing pieces, others wrote their names on it and mailed it home as souvenirs. Hardtack could outlive you after all. Why not send it as a keepsake? And when rations ran short, foraging, which was the polite word for stealing, soldiers raided orchards, barns, chicken coops. Farmers complained bitterly. Armies replied with a shrug. Hungry men will take what they need. It was part of the war. Evenings were slightly better. After drills and chores, soldiers gathered around fires. They sang songs. Popular ones were sentimental, Home, Sweet Home, Lorna, slow, mournful tunes that made men cry quietly in the dark because they missed home, because they were lonely. Other times they told jokes. Civil War humor was practical, teasing officers, complaining about the army. One soldier wrote that their colonel was a man of great courage as long as there was no danger. Dry, biting, almost modern. And then there were the superstitions. Soldiers were deeply superstitious. Some carried lucky charms, coins, rabbit feet, locks of hair. Others believed certain days were cursed. One Union regiment refused to fight on a Friday, convinced it would bring disaster. Another believed if you dreamed of home, you would be wounded the next day. And religion was everywhere. Soldiers prayed constantly, chaplains preached revival meetings, hymns drifted across camps. The war, for many, became a strange blend of mud, bullets, and old-fashioned tent revivals. Now let's move away from the rank and file and drift into the personal quirks of the men who commanded them. Generals were characters, some brilliant, some disastrous, all eccentric in their own ways. Take George McClellan, commander of the Union Army of the Potomac. He was brilliant at organizing. He trained his men well. They loved him, but he hated fighting. He was convinced the Confederacy had triple the number of soldiers they actually did. So he avoided battle for months. Lincoln grew so frustrated he wrote, "If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it." Sarcasm was presidential in 1862. Then there was General Ambrose Burnside. Yes, the man whose magnificent facial hair gave us the word sideburns. His whiskers were glorious, his leadership less so. At the Battle of Fredericksburg, he ordered repeated charges against a stone wall manned by Confederate rifles. Thousands died. The wall stood. Burnside did not inspire confidence, but he looked good while failing. On the Confederate side, you had Thomas Stonewall Jackson, a deeply religious, deeply strange man. He believed pepper made his left leg weak. He sucked lemons constantly, even during battle. He raised one arm in the air to balance his body's fluids. And yet, he was a brilliant tactician. Soldiers adored him. They also thought he was a little bit insane. And Robert E. Lee, calm, stoic, admired. He once said he wished he had never taken command because every victory cost him the lives of his beloved men. Poetic, tragic, but he still kept fighting. Let's pause on soldier letters. They're one of the most human parts of the war. Men wrote constantly. To wives, parents, siblings, letters were lifelines. Some were mundane, send socks, send cheese, send anything edible. Others were deeply emotional. If I do not return, remember me kindly. Soldiers poured their hearts onto paper, sometimes with terrible spelling, sometimes with awkward tenderness, always with the sense that each letter might be their last. And on the other side, families wrote back. Encouragement, prayers, news from home, sometimes scolding. A farmer's wife might write, "We are short of hands. If you come home, remember there are still chores to do." Romantic. Mail service was surprisingly fast. A letter from Washington to the front could arrive in days. Soldiers lived for it. The arrival of the mail wagon was the highlight of the week. Those who didn't get letters sank into silence. So day-to-day life. Drill, chores, coffee, complaining, songs, superstitions, letters, and somewhere in between waiting, always waiting, waiting for orders, waiting for pay, waiting for news, waiting for the next terrible march. Because marching was the true misery of soldiering. Not the battles, not even the food, the endless walking, 20, 30 miles in a day, in wool uniforms, in heat, in rain, in snow, with blisters, with no shoes sometimes. The roads were muddy, rutted, full of wagons. One Confederate soldier said, "Our feet are as raw as beefsteak and smell about as good." A bedtime image, if there ever was one. So what was it actually like? It was not glory. It was monotony, broken by fear. It was coffee for breakfast, superstition at night, and a letter clutched in your pocket during battle. It was being led by men with magnificent whiskers, strange diets, or crippling indecision. And through it all, the soldiers endured, some by faith, some by humor, some just by grinding their teeth and waiting for the war to end. All right, let's drift again. In part 3, we'll walk into the truly strange side, the music, the medical oddities, the makeshift amusements, and the bizarre personal worlds that soldiers carried into the chaos of the Civil War. For now, rest easy. We'll pick this up again soon. Still here, still awake, or maybe not awake, which is the real goal. Either way, let's drift on. We've marched with them, we've eaten the hardtack, we've sat through sermons and superstition. Now let's slide sideways into the stranger corners of this war, the little details that don't usually make the textbooks. First, music. If you dropped into a Civil War camp at night, you wouldn't always hear gunfire. You might hear fiddles, harmonicas, banjo strings twanging in the dark. Soldiers loved music. It was comfort. It was escape. Every regiment seemed to have someone who could play, sometimes whole bands. Union and Confederate camps were close enough that the music drifted across the lines. Imagine it, men who had spent the day trying to kill each other lying on their blankets, listening to the same melody float through the night air. Home, Sweet Home was especially popular. Soldiers on both sides cried quietly into the dirt, because the truth was simple, they all missed home. And sometimes, this part feels like a dream. They sang together. One side would start a song, the other would join in. Thousands of voices, enemies in daylight, harmonizing in the dark. Then silence, then war again at sunrise. Now medicine, and if you're squeamish, well, too bad. The Civil War wasn't gentle. We've already talked about amputations, but there were other quirks, like laudanum, an opium tincture that doctors prescribed for just about everything. Toothache, take laudanum. Fever, laudanum. Dysentery, laudanum. Insomnia, laudanum. Soldiers floated through pain in a hazy fog of narcotics, which sounds soothing until you realize the withdrawal later was not. Quinine was handed out for malaria. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Whiskey was also medicine, at least according to surgeons. And when whiskey ran out, soldiers swore by turpentine, camphor, or whatever foul liquid could be found in the supply wagon. Then there was the curious case of blue mass pills. These were made with mercury. Doctors handed them out freely, believing mercury purged the system. In reality, it poisoned soldiers slowly. Tremors, tooth loss, confusion. Some men marched into battle half-mad from their own medicine. And if you were lucky enough to survive all that, you still faced lice, the true companions of every army. Soldiers named them greybacks. They joked about hosting louse races on tin plates, because if you couldn't beat them, you might as well gamble on them. Let's move into soldier pastimes. Because boredom needed killing almost as much as enemies did. Cards were the big one. Poker, euchre, whist. Wages were small, tobacco, buttons, extra rations. Dice rattled on mess tables. One Confederate soldier wrote that half his regiment owed the other half money. Baseball was another. Yes, baseball. The game spread rapidly during the war. Soldiers played in camps, in prison yards, even between battles. By the time peace returned, baseball was practically America's pastime, thanks to the Civil War. Which means, in a way, we owe modern baseball to thousands of bored men stuck in muddy camps. And when no cards or bats were handy, whittling. Soldiers carved wood into pipes, rings, canes. They embroidered. They staged mock parades. They even put on plays. Yes, men in full beards stuffed into makeshift dresses, entertaining each other in a kind of tragic wartime theater. Because why not? If you're surrounded by death, you might as well laugh at yourself. But the war wasn't only about soldiers. Let's drift into the lives of those around them. Civilians were never far. Farmers saw their fields trampled. Families saw homes turned into hospitals. Women followed armies, selling food, mending clothes, sometimes working as nurses. Children watched battles from rooftops, thinking it all a kind of horrible game. And then there were the camp followers, not an elegant term. It included wives, laundresses, cooks, and yes, prostitutes. Armies ran on these invisible workers. Without them, soldiers would have been dirtier, hungrier, and even lonelier. Disease spread here too, of course. The Union Army actually regulated prostitution in some cities, issuing medical checks and licenses. Bureaucracy finds a way, even in chaos. Speaking of generals again, their eccentricities deserve more attention. Because if you're going to lead thousands of men, you might as well have quirks. General William Tecumseh Sherman, fiery, brilliant, often accused of madness, he once declared, "War is hell." Simple, direct, honest. Soldiers admired him because he didn't sugarcoat it. His letters home were blunt, even cruel. But he was, ironically, one of the few generals who understood what modern war would look like. Then there was Confederate General Braxton Bragg, universally hated by his own men, by his officers, by basically everyone. He once wrote an order as his own commanding officer, then responded to it as his own subordinate, disagreeing with himself in writing. No one was surprised. And Ulysses S. Grant, Union General, future president, quiet, rumpled, a little sloppy. Rumors swirled that he was always drunk. In truth, he drank occasionally, but mostly when he was sidelined and miserable. When he was fighting, he was steady, calm. He chewed cigars constantly, smoking through thousands. His men adored him because, unlike so many generals, he actually won. Back to soldiers now, because they carried small worlds with them. Trinkets, letters, photographs, pocket Bibles, locks of hair, a pressed flower. These were talismans, a piece of home stuffed into a haversack. One soldier carried his dog's collar, another, a single spoon carved by his mother. Many carried daguerreotypes, tiny, fragile photos in cases. They stared at them in the dark, memorizing faces, hoping they'd see them again. And some carried, stranger things, a lucky bullet, a bent coin, a small stone from the creek near their childhood home, things that meant nothing to anyone else, but everything to the man clutching them as he lay in the mud. So when we ask, what was it like to fight in the Civil War, we have to remember the little things, the harmonica at night, the dice rattling on tin plates, the laugh over a louse race, the superstition about dreaming of home, the ridiculous general chewing lemons like candy. These weren't stories of glory, they were coping mechanisms, ways to survive a war that was too big, too dirty, too tragic to understand all at once. Life in the army forced men together in ways they'd never experienced. You slept next to each other, ate together, marched together, fought together. Your tent mate wasn't just a buddy, he was your lifeline. If you were too sick to fetch water, he brought it. If you collapsed on the march, he hauled you up. If you were killed, he wrote your family. These bonds were so strong that soldiers sometimes called each other brothers more than they wrote to their actual brothers. In some diaries, you can feel the affection, gentle teasing, shared jokes, little acts of kindness. A soldier might write, "John gave me his last piece of tobacco, I will never forget it." Not exactly poetry, but in war, that was love. But of course, death haunted those friendships. It wasn't like the movies, where everyone dies in slow motion. Death in the Civil War was quick, brutal, often anonymous. A cannonball didn't leave time for last words. A musket shot across a smoky field meant you never even knew what hit you. What lingered wasn't the death itself, but the aftermath, the empty blanket, the silent spot in the mess line. Soldiers often wrote about the shock of waking up and realizing their tent mate would never wake again. Some buried their friends themselves, marking grave with wooden boards carved with shaky knives. Others simply marched on, leaving comrades behind, because the army moved whether you were grieving or not. And when letters went home, they tried to soften it. He died bravely. He did not suffer, even when the truth was uglier, a kindness of words, if not reality. Fear, of course, was constant. Soldiers tried to act brave. They joked, they sang, they swaggered. But when battle loomed, diaries and letters admitted the truth. Men shook uncontrollably. Some vomited before marching out. Some prayed, some cursed. And some simply froze. The army called it cowardice. Today we'd call it trauma. A soldier standing stiff, unable to move forward while the line advanced, often punished, sometimes executed. Fear had no safe outlet. You had to push it down, hide it, pretend you were fine. Others dealt with fear in stranger ways. Some grew fatalistic. If the bullet has my name on it, so be it. They marched into fire with eerie calm, convinced nothing they did could change fate. Others clung harder to charms and prayers. A lucky coin, a Bible verse, a whispered promise that if they survived, they'd go home and never complain about farm chores again. Now let's drift into the way soldiers thought about home. Home wasn't just a place, it was a dream. It was what kept men alive in the mud. They wrote letters filled with small, ordinary details. How are the apple trees? Did the cow calf yet? Because the ordinary mattered more than the war. Some soldiers idealized home so much that returning later was a shock. The farm wasn't as green as they remembered. The wife had aged. The children barely knew them. Home had become more dream than reality. But during the war, the dream was a lifeline. Death didn't just shape friendships, it shaped faith. Some soldiers found God in the war. Tent revivals swelled with men suddenly worried about eternity. Hymns echoed across fields where bodies still lay unburied. The war was proof, for them, that life was fragile and heaven was close. Others lost faith. They saw too much. They buried too many. They doubted the sermons, the chaplains, the idea that any just God would allow thousands of men to rot in ditches for the sake of politics. One Confederate soldier wrote simply, "I no longer pray, the heavens are brass." Faith became another battlefield. Some men clung tighter, others let go. All of them wondered, in their own ways, what it all meant. And then there was the silence. When battles ended, the noise stopped, but the silence was louder. Soldiers wrote about lying awake at night, staring into the dark, listening to nothing but their own hearts beating. Some couldn't sleep, some wandered the camps, some wrote letters by firelight, trying to fill the quiet with words. The Civil War wasn't constant violence. It was long stretches of nothing, broken by sudden chaos, followed by unbearable silence. That rhythm wore on men more than the fighting itself, waiting, dreading, remembering. And we should talk about desertion, because not every soldier stayed. Thousands slipped away. Some went home for good. Others left for a while, then returned. Union and Confederate both struggled with men simply walking off in the night. Why? Because fear, boredom, despair. Because letters from home begged them to return. Because their families were starving. Because they decided the war wasn't worth it. And honestly, who could blame them? Deserters were shamed, hunted, sometimes executed. But for every punishment, another man slipped away. In a war that stretched on year after year, loyalty had limits. Now friendship, fear, faith, death, heavy things. But remember, this is bedtime history. We're not here to shock. We are here to float through it, slow and even. So imagine those soldiers again, sitting by fires, passing a pipe, whispering in the dark about home, promising to look after each other, laughing softly at a bad joke, pretending for a moment that tomorrow wasn't marching closer. So what was it actually like to fight in the Civil War? It was living with fear, but hiding it. It was loving your tent mate like a brother, then burying him before breakfast. It was dreaming of home until the dream hurt more than the war. It was silence heavier than cannon fire. And through it all, soldiers carried on. Because what else could they do? The war was too big to stop. All they could control was how they faced the next morning. It's easy to forget that most of a soldier's life wasn't battle. It was walking, day after day, mile after mile, wool uniforms in summer heat, thin blankets in winter cold, and boots, if you had them. Many men didn't. They trudged barefoot, leaving bloody footprints on frozen ground. Union and Confederate both marched until they dropped. 20, sometimes 30 miles in a single day, with knapsacks, rifles, cartridge boxes, haversacks and canteens, 50 pounds of gear. One soldier wrote, "It is not the enemy that breaks us, it is the march." And then there was the weather. Rain was relentless. Roads turned into rivers of mud. Wagons sank to the axles. Horses and mules collapsed in the muck. Soldiers pulled them out by hand, cursing, shoving, straining. And when they couldn't move the wagons, they abandoned them. Supplies lost to the mud. The mud swallowed everything. Boots stuck so deep you had to pull with both hands to get free. Cannons mired down and left behind. Soldiers joked that Virginia mud was the strongest defender of the Confederacy. Summer wasn't kinder. Heat-baked men in heavy wool, sweat-soaked uniforms until they reeked. Water was scarce. Canteens dried out miles from the next creek. Some drank from ditches, from puddles, from anything wet, even if cows had been there first. Dysentery marched right alongside them. And winter was merciless. Snow, ice, freezing rain, tents offered little protection. Fires barely warmed frozen fingers, shoes split apart, blankets stiffened with frost. Some men wrapped rags around their feet or stole fence rails to burn. Others simply endured, huddled together, waiting for the thaw. The seasons shaped the war more than strategy ever did. Campaigns stopped when roads turned impassable. Battles paused for winter quarters. Armies moved like sluggish beasts, bound by mud and ice. Generals might dream of glory, but mud decided when and where they fought. Now let's drift into the scenery. The Civil War wasn't fought on distant plains or deserts. It was fought in the backyards of ordinary people. Wheat fields, orchards, small towns, wooden fences lining dusty lanes. Soldiers marched past whitewashed churches, past red barns, past families staring silently from porches. Sometimes they destroyed those places. Fields trampled, crops seized, houses burned. Other times, they just passed through, leaving only muddy footprints and the sound of drums fadding into the distance. One soldier wrote, "Every mile is another farm made poorer." War was not just soldiers against soldiers, it was soldiers against the land. And then there were rivers. Rivers cut across the country, wide and fast. Armies had to ford them, build bridges, or float across on makeshift rafts. Men stripped off clothes, held rifles overhead, and stumbled through freezing water. Some drowned. Others came out the far side shivering, uniforms soaked, teeth chattering, and then kept marching. Pontoon bridges were miracles of engineering, but also magnets for cannon fire. Soldiers crossing them prayed the planks would hold, that no shell would strike. Every step across felt like balancing over death. Marching wasn't silent either. Imagine the sound, thousands of boots thudding in rhythm, wagon wheels creaking, horses snorting, drums beating, men coughing, singing, cursing, the smell, sweat, smoke, manure, unwashed wool. The sight, a long snaking line of blue or gray stretching for miles, banners waving limp in the sun. It wasn't glorious, it was monotonous, one foot after the other, for days, for weeks. Soldiers called themselves foot cavalry, not proudly, bitterly, because cavalry at least rode horses. Infantry just walked until their legs gave out. But sometimes there were strange, almost beautiful moments. Marching at night under a full moon, the line of soldiers glowing silver in the dark, rifles glinting, or marching in autumn, leaves crunching underfoot, air crisp, fires crackling when they stopped. One soldier wrote that despite everything, the marches gave him a chance to see the country. Hills, rivers, valleys, towns. He called it a terrible kind of tourism, which is one way to think about it. Then there was hunger. Marching burned calories that rations never replaced. Salt pork and hardtack weren't enough. Men grew gaunt. Their uniforms hung loose. They dreamed of food constantly. Apple pie, fresh bread, butter, milk. Ordinary meals became fantasies. When they foraged, they ate everything. Green apples, raw corn, stolen chickens. One Union soldier confessed to eating an entire pumpkin raw. Another bragged about catching a pig with his bare hands. Hunger made men inventive and desperate. Exhaustion was the constant companion. Marching all day, setting camp at night, then standing picket duty until dawn. Sleep came in stolen moments, a nap on a fence rail, a doze on a muddy road. Soldiers joked they could sleep standing if only the sergeant would let them. Some collapsed mid-march and had to be carried. Others simply disappeared into the roadside brush, too tired to continue. Officers yelled, prodded, threatened, but exhaustion always won eventually. So what was it actually like to fight in the Civil War? It was walking until your feet bled, sleeping in mud, drinking ditch water, burning fence rails to keep warm, watching the seasons turn not by calendars, but by whether the mud froze solid or the dust rose in clouds. It was a war where weather and landscape mattered more than glory, where mud could defeat an army as surely as bullets, and where every mile carried soldiers farther from home, deeper into a war that seemed to stretch forever. All right, let's let the march end for tonight. In part 6, we'll step into the world of prisoners, the grim, strange existence of captured soldiers, their daily struggles, and how prison camps became their own kind of nightmare. For now, the march is over, the campfires are lit, and it's time to rest. So here's the thing, when you think of prisoners of war, you might imagine something orderly. Guard towers, clean barracks, maybe a little boredom, maybe some card games. The Civil War version? Yeah, no, it was more like, shove thousands of hungry, wounded men behind a fence and hope they don't die too fast. The most infamous was Andersonville in Georgia, a place so bad it still whispered like a curse. But there were plenty of others, Elmira in New York, Camp Douglas in Chicago, Belle Isle in Richmond. North and South both had them, and both sides were equally bad at running them. Let's take Andersonville first. Imagine a giant open field surrounded by a wooden stockade. No roofs, no shelters, just ground, and in the middle a little trickle of water running through. Thousands of men crowded together, exposed to sun, rain, and wind. They dug holes in the ground to hide in. They made ragged tents from scraps of cloth. The water, polluted almost instantly, men drank it anyway. Food was scarce. Guards tossed in cornmeal and beans when they felt like it. Men fought over scraps. They boiled weeds for soup. Starvation hollowed faces, bent spines, broke spirits. Some wrote letters home begging for food packages. Others didn't live long enough to get them. Disease spread fast. Dysentery, scurvy, smallpox. The smell of sickness was constant. Men coughed themselves to death. They lay in the mud, too weak to stand. Others just sat down one day and didn't get up again. And yet soldiers survived somehow. They formed little groups for protection called mess squads. They shared what little food they had. They patched each other's clothes. They kept watch at night against thieves. Because yes, there were prison gangs, even here. Groups of desperate men who robbed weaker ones for a crust of bread. It was survival stripped down to the bone. Now switch sides. Union prisons weren't much better. At Elmira in upstate New York, winters were brutal. Confederate prisoners froze to death in unheated barracks. The food was barely edible. The water, contaminated. Rats became part of the diet. Prisoners joked that they were on the Elmira diet, one step away from starvation. Camp Douglas in Chicago was another disaster. Mud everywhere, poor drainage, outbreaks of smallpox. One Confederate prisoner described it as a place of slow death. And at Belle Isle, a small island in the James River, Union prisoners were kept in open tents through freezing Richmond winters. Snow, ice, and starvation wore them down. By spring, the survivors looked like walking skeletons. But here's the strange thing. Despite the horror, prison camps became little worlds of their own. Men carved trinkets out of wood and bone. They played cards with homemade decks. They told stories. They organized prayer meetings. Some even held plays, acting out Shakespeare in tattered uniforms just to keep from going mad. And the black market thrived. Guards sometimes smuggled in tobacco, bread, or even liquor for the right price. Prisoners traded buttons, spoons, scraps of cloth. One Union soldier at Andersonville remembered paying 3 buttons for a cup of cornmeal. Buttons were literally currency. Escapes happened, of course. Prisoners dug tunnels, slipping under the stockades. Some made it out, most were caught. Guards posted bloodhounds to sniff out escapees. The woods around camps were dotted with shallow tunnels, half finished, abandoned when discovered. One famous escape at Libby Prison in Richmond saw more than 100 Union officers dig their way out through a tunnel. Dozens got away. Many didn't. Still, for men trapped in misery, Even trying gave them hope. And then there were executions. Prisoners who killed or robbed fellow captives were sometimes tried by their peers. At Andersonville, 6 men known as the Raiders, a prison gang who terrorized weaker prisoners, were captured by fellow inmates, given a trial, and hanged inside the camp. Thousands watched in silence. It was a grim kind of justice, carried out by men with nothing left to lose. So what was it like to be a Civil War prisoner? It was hunger gnawing every hour. It was lying in mud, staring at the sky, wondering if you'd see home again. It was making a spoon into a treasure, a button into money, a prayer into a lifeline. One soldier summed it up. The war outside was fought with guns. The war inside was fought with patience. And the thing is, most didn't win that war. Tens of thousands died in prison camps, more than were killed in some of the biggest battles. Disease and starvation claimed them quietly, one by one. No bugles, no drums, just silence. All right, let's leave the prison walls behind. In Part 7, we'll drift into the hospitals, the strange, grim world of Civil War medicine, amputations, and the women who tried to put the pieces back together. But for now, let's step out of the gate, breathe free air again, and rest for a moment. Or maybe I should say, welcome in, because now we're stepping into the hospitals of the Civil War. And if you're picturing clean white sheets and calm Florence Nightingale figures, yeah, no, more like piles of limbs, whiskey bottles, and the constant sound of sawing. Medicine in the 1860s was advanced. Germ theory was barely a whisper. Surgeons didn't wash their hands between patients. They reused bandages. Instruments were wiped on their coats, if wiped at all. Infection was inevitable. One doctor bluntly said, "We lost as many men to our ignorance as to the enemy." And yet, this was the world soldiers entered when they were wounded. Let's start with the big one, amputation. It was the go-to solution for almost any serious limb wound. Bullet in the arm, off it goes. Shattered leg bone, gone. A surgeon's motto was save the life, not the limb. And to be fair, they were often right. With no antibiotics, shattered bones usually meant gangrene. Amputation gave you a chance. But the process was brutal. Surgeons worked fast. 3 minutes was about average. A tourniquet, a saw, some chloroform if you were lucky, a bottle of whiskey if you were. The sawdust on the floor was often stained red, used to soak up blood. Piles of amputated limbs grew outside the tents. One witness remembered seeing a stack as high as a man. And yet soldiers joked about it. They called themselves stump soldiers. They carved wooden legs, made light of their missing arms, because humor, even grim humor, was all they had. Now, anesthesia. It did exist. Chloroform and ether were both widely used. In fact, about 95% of Civil War surgeries used anesthesia. So the old image of screaming men being held down, not quite true. Most were unconscious. But the aftercare, that was where things fell apart. Because infections set in fast, doctors didn't know about bacteria. They called it hospital gangrene. Wounds turned black. The smell was overwhelming. Men wasted away with fevers. Survival was a coin toss. Hospitals themselves were chaotic. At first, they were just farmhouses, barns, churches, any building that could hold the wounded. Floors stained with blood, walls splattered. No ventilation, no sanitation. Nurses swarmed over cots, trying to feed and wash men, often without enough supplies. Later, proper hospital complexes were built, long wooden wards, rows of cots, better airflow. The Union in particular improved its system, building huge medical facilities near Washington. But in the field, it was still rough. A tent, a cot, a surgeon with a bone saw. That was your lot. And here, where women come in. Thousands of women stepped into the chaos as nurses. Clara Barton, later founder of the Red Cross, became famous for bringing supplies and care to battlefields. Dorothea Dix organized nursing corps. Walt Whitman, yes, the poet, served as a volunteer nurse. writing about soldiers with heartbreaking tenderness. These women brought order where there was none. They washed wounds, spoon-fed broth, wrote letters for the dying. They became symbols of comfort, almost angelic figures in the midst of horror. One soldier said, "The sight of a woman's face did more than all the medicine." But medicine wasn't just physical. Soldiers needed spiritual healing too. Chaplains moved through the wards, praying with men, reading scripture. For many, death was closer than recovery. Letters were written, wills dictated, final words whispered to strangers who promised to remember them. And the letters, that's something haunting. Nurses and visitors often wrote home for soldiers too weak to hold a pen. Mothers, wives, children received words of love, scribbled in shaky handwriting. Sometimes the letters arrived after the soldier was already gone. Alternative medicine thrived as well. Herbal remedies, folk cures, anything that might help. Soldiers chewed willow bark for pain. Some swore by onions for infection. Others begged for whiskey, sometimes as medicine, sometimes just as escape. Doctors tried what they had: calomel, a mercury compound that was more poison than cure; opium for pain, quinine for malaria, laudanum for coughs. The Civil War practically created America's opiate problem, dosing soldiers so heavily that thousands went home addicted. They called it the soldier's disease. And then there were the wounds themselves. Minié balls, those conical bullets, didn't just pierce, they shattered. A bone hit by a Minié ball didn't crack, it exploded. Flesh tore apart, organs were mangled. Bayonets and sabers caused fewer wounds than you'd think. Bullets did most of the damage, and surgeons saw it all. One Confederate doctor said, "The battlefield is a museum of human misery," and he wasn't exaggerating. But despite the horror, progress did happen. The Civil War pushed medicine forward. Ambulance systems were developed, with stretcher-bearers trained to move the wounded. Triage was introduced, sorting men by who could be saved, who needed immediate care, and who couldn't be helped. Nursing became a respected profession. Prosthetics advanced. The war's pain built a foundation for modern medicine. Still, for the men living it, none of that mattered. For them, the hospital was a place of fear. If you went in with a wounded arm, you might come out missing it. If you went in with fever, you might not come out at all. So what was it like to end up in a Civil War hospital? It was waking to the sound of sawing. It was breathing the thick air of blood, sweat, and chloroform. It was holding a stranger's hand as your leg disappeared. It was staring at the pile of limbs outside and wondering if yours would be next. And yet it was also hearing a nurse's kind word, feeling a cool rag on your forehead, listening to someone read poetry at your bedside, finding, somehow, a shred of humanity in the darkest place. Still with me? Good. Tonight, let's slow things down even slower than usual, because for all the battles and marches, most of a soldier's Civil War experience was waiting, sitting in camp, killing time, and occasionally killing lice. So picture it, a line of tents, smoke rising from campfires, the low buzz of voices, no bullets flying, no marching orders, just thousands of men trying to make a routine in the middle of chaos. Daily life was simple but repetitive. Reveille at dawn, the bugle or drum pulling men out of their thin blankets, roll call, breakfast, drills, then more drills, endless drills, shoulder arms, present arms, march left, march right. It was tedious. Soldiers hated it, but officers swore it kept discipline. After that, chores, chopping wood, hauling water, digging latrines, the unglamorous work of keeping an army alive. Some called it fatigue duty, and they weren't kidding. Soldiers joked that fatigue duty was just punishment with a shovel. And then there was food. If you could call it that. Rations usually meant hardtack, salt pork, beans, and coffee. Hardtack was infamous, a square cracker so hard you could break a tooth on it. Soldiers soaked it in coffee, fried it in bacon grease, or just gnawed it like a dog with a bone. Some crackers had bugs inside. The men nicknamed them worm castles. They joked about whether to eat the weevils or count them as extra protein. Salt pork was greasy, salty, and often rancid. Beans could be decent if you had time to cook them. Coffee was the real prize. Soldiers wrote home begging for coffee. They brewed it strong, weak, or even rebrewed the grounds just to get a taste. Confederates with the blockade cutting supplies often substituted chicory, acorns, or roasted peanuts. It wasn't coffee, but it was close enough. Sometimes soldiers got lucky, fresh vegetables, milk, or even pie from locals, but mostly it was hardtack and pork, day after day. So what did men do when they weren't drilling, eating, or digging? They entertained themselves. Cards were everywhere: poker, euchre, whist. Soldiers gambled with whatever they had: buttons, tobacco, scraps of food. Dice games were popular too. Some men lost their entire rations in a single night of bad luck. Others swore off gambling forever after one disastrous hand. Music filled the camps. Soldiers brought fiddles, banjos, harmonicas. They sang folk songs, ballads, and parodies of military tunes. Some companies had full brass bands. Music lifted spirits, passed time, and sometimes carried across enemy lines. Union and Confederate pickets occasionally traded songs back and forth at night, as if the war could be paused for a tune. Writing letters was another constant. Men poured their loneliness, their boredom, their hopes into paper. They described camp life, asked for socks, worried about crops at home. Letters were lifelines both ways. Receiving one from home could brighten an entire week. And then there were games. Wrestling matches, foot races, tug-of-war. Baseball, believe it or not, was hugely popular. Soldiers played makeshift games with sticks and balls. The sport spread across the country through the armies, and after the war, it became America's pastime. You could say the Civil War gave baseball its big break. There were also less innocent games: pranks, roughhousing, and the occasional camp brawl. One soldier wrote that fights usually ended when everyone was too tired to care. Another swore the worst punishment was boredom itself. Of course, camp life wasn't all lighthearted. There were lice everywhere. Soldiers called them greybacks. They infested uniforms, blankets, hair. Men sat for hours skirmishing, picking lice off each other's clothes. Campfires often served double duty, cooking food and burning bugs. Some soldiers joked that lice were the most loyal companions they had. And then there was sickness. Camps were breeding grounds for disease. Measles, smallpox, dysentery. More soldiers died of disease than of bullets. Poor sanitation, bad food, and close quarters made illness inevitable. Doctors did what they could, but prevention wasn't their strong suit. Latrines too close to water supplies meant entire regiments suffered at once. Still, soldiers found ways to make camp life their own. They carved pipes, whittled figures, wrote journals. They put on mock parades, complete with ridiculous uniforms made from blankets and tin pans. They gave their tents names like Hotel de Hardtack or Palace of Pork. Humor kept them sane. Religion played a role too. Camp revivals swept through both armies. Ministers preached under trees, soldiers sang hymns, men knelt in the mud to pray. For some, faith offered comfort and meaning. For others, it was just another way to pass the time. And every now and then, camp life meant contact with civilians. Children sold pies to soldiers. Women brought milk, bread, or sometimes just curious stares. Soldiers traded buttons or trinkets with locals. In occupied areas, interactions could be tense, sometimes friendly, sometimes hostile. Armies left their mark not only on battlefields, but on towns and families trying to survive around them. But at the end of the day, camp always came back to waiting. Waiting for orders, waiting for letters, waiting for the next march, the next battle, the next anything. Soldiers grew restless, weary, homesick. They carved calendars into wood. They counted down the days of their enlistments. They dreamed of going home, even as the war dragged on longer than anyone expected. So what was it actually like in a Civil War camp? It was hardtack crumbs in your blanket. It was coffee boiled in a tin cup black with soot. It was music drifting through the night, mingling with coughs and laughter. It was boredom so heavy that a lice hunt felt like entertainment. It was life suspended, not quite peace, not quite war, just waiting, always waiting. All right, the campfires are burning low, cards are folded away, letters are tucked under pillows. The men settle in for another restless night, dreaming of home. Tonight we're stepping into a part of the Civil War that didn't involve muskets or marching boots. Instead, it was carried out in whispers, coded notes, and shadowy meetings behind closed doors. The spy game. And yes, even in the 1860s, it was alive and well. So let's start with a simple truth. Both sides were desperate for information. Armies moved slowly, communication was clumsy, and even a day's warning could make or break a campaign. That meant spies were priceless, dangerous too. If you got caught, there wasn't much of a trial. Rope, tree, end of story. The Union built one of the first organized intelligence networks. Alan Pinkerton, founder of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, ran security for Abraham Lincoln early in the war. He's famous for foiling an alleged assassination plot against Lincoln on his way to Washington in 1861. Pinkerton later oversaw Union espionage, though to be fair, his estimates of Confederate strength were hilariously inflated. He often doubled or tripled enemy numbers, which made Union generals hesitate more than they should. Still, the Pinkertons ran agents behind Confederate lines, gathering what they could. Newspapers, troop counts, whispers in taverns, all fed back to Washington. But the Confederacy wasn't sitting idle either. They had their own spy networks, some of them surprisingly effective. Richmond became a hub of intrigue, and one of the most famous Confederate spies was a woman, Belle Boyd. Belle was bold, loud, some might even say reckless. A Virginia native, she charmed Union officers, then slipped information to Confederate generals. She supposedly passed intelligence before the Battle of Front Royal that helped Stonewall Jackson win a victory. Belle was arrested multiple times, imprisoned, even banished, but she always found her way back into the game. Women, in fact, played a huge role in espionage. Take Rose O'Neal Greenhow, a Washington socialite. She moved in high political circles, befriended senators and generals, and passed secrets to the Confederacy. In 1861, her intelligence helped the South at the Battle of Bull Run. The Union eventually caught her and kept her under house arrest, but not before she had already made her mark. On the Union side, women like Elizabeth Van Lew in Richmond ran sophisticated spy rings. Van Lew pretended to be a harmless eccentric, but behind the scenes, she organized networks of servants, shopkeepers, and Union sympathizers. She even placed an agent inside Confederate President Jefferson Davis's household. Her nickname later, Crazy Bet, a cover that worked perfectly. Now, let's talk about the tools of the trade. Ciphers and codes were common, messages written in invisible ink, notes hidden in shoes or sewn into clothing. Couriers carried letters rolled into tiny balls and swallowed if capture seemed near. Telegraph wires were tapped. Newspapers were scoured for hints. Sometimes information was smuggled in the most unexpected ways. One story tells of a courier carrying intelligence in her hair bun. Another hid it inside hollowed-out eggs. Creativity was survival. And not all espionage was cloak and dagger. Much of it was just careful observation, counting regiments marching down a road, noting the direction of wagon trains, listening to gossip in train stations. Small pieces of information that, stitched together, told a larger story. The Confederacy also leaned heavily on Copperheads, Northern sympathizers who opposed the war. Some of them acted as informants, others just spread discontent. The line between spy and agitator blurred constantly. The Union, in turn, infiltrated Confederate networks, sometimes planting double agents. Suspicion was everywhere. Letters were opened, people watched, neighbors whispered. For ordinary civilians, just talking to the wrong soldier could get you branded a traitor. And then there were the escapes, that felt straight out of a novel. Take the Richmond, Libby prison escape in 1864. Union officers dug a tunnel under the prison and more than 100 men slipped out. Some made it back to Union lines, others were recaptured. But the tunnel itself became legendary, a reminder that brains could sometimes outmatch bars. Or consider the secret line, a Confederate courier route running through Maryland. Messages and supplies passed hand to hand, often under the noses of Union patrols. Women disguised as farmwives or market sellers played key roles, slipping intelligence in baskets of eggs or bolts of cloth. But spying wasn't glamorous. It was nerve-wracking, lonely, and often it failed. Agents were caught, imprisoned, executed. Belle Boyd herself spent months in Union prisons. Rose Greenhow drowned off the coast of North Carolina while trying to run a blockade. And half the time, the intelligence gathered was useless, outdated by the time it reached commanders, or exaggerated into nonsense. Wars were rarely won by spies, but they added another layer of tension, a constant undercurrent of paranoia. So what was it like to be part of this shadow war? It was slipping a note into your shoe and praying no one searched you. It was smiling at an enemy officer while memorizing the numbers on his regiment's flag. It was walking through streets you called home, knowing one wrong glance could end with a rope around your neck. For most soldiers, the war was fought with rifles, but for a few, it was fought with whispers. The Union had the factories, the manpower, and supposedly the political stability. But in reality, things were messy. Abraham Lincoln spent the war juggling not just generals and battles, but also public opinion that swung like a pendulum. In 1861, people rallied around the flag. "Save the Union" was the cry, but as the years dragged on and casualties mounted, enthusiasm wavered. Newspapers criticized Lincoln daily. Copperhead Democrats, northern critics of the war, called him a tyrant, accused him of trampling civil liberties, and demanded peace at any cost. Draft riots erupted in cities. The most infamous was New York, 1863. Poor men, angry that the draft could be avoided by paying $300 for a substitute, exploded into violence. For 4 days, mobs burned buildings, lynched African Americans, and clashed with soldiers. It took troops fresh from Gettysburg to restore order. One soldier wrote home, "We fought the rebels last week. This week we fought our own." Meanwhile, the South had its own problems. The Confederacy fought for independence, but unity was shaky. States' rights, the very principle they claimed to defend, often got in the way of central government. Governors clashed with President Jefferson Davis. Some refused to send troops or supplies outside their borders. Blockades strangled southern trade. Shortages became severe. Salt, coffee, cloth, even shoes all scarce. Families scraped by on substitutes, coffee made from roasted okra, shoes made from wood and rope. Inflation skyrocketed. A Confederate dollar by 1865 was worth a few cents at best. Riots broke out too. In Richmond, women stormed bakeries in 1863, shouting for bread. Confederate soldiers themselves sometimes deserted to help starving families. The myth of a united South cracked under hunger and exhaustion. For both sides, life at home meant constant worry. Families waited for letters. Mothers scanned casualty lists in newspapers. Wives tried to keep farms running, shops open, children fed. Communities held funerals for sons who never came home, or sometimes never came back at all. Grief became a daily rhythm. Women shouldered enormous burdens. They plowed fields, ran businesses, managed slaves on plantations, or took factory jobs. Many became nurses or aid workers. Some disguised themselves as men and joined the armies. Others simply endured, their lives reshaped by absence and fear. Politics played out in bedrooms and kitchens, as much as in Congress halls. In the North, abolition became central. The Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 changed the war's moral stakes. For some, it was a triumph of justice. For others, It was just one more reason to resist Lincoln. The draft plus emancipation made the war unpopular in many working-class communities who feared freedmen would compete for jobs. In the South, slavery's foundation crumbled. Enslaved people fled plantations, following Union armies or forming their own communities in the wilderness. Some joined the Union Army outright, wearing blue and carrying rifles against their former masters. Confederate leaders debated arming slaves, but by the time they seriously considered it, the war was nearly lost. Economically, the war touched everything. In the North, factories boomed, railroads expanded, industrialists grew rich supplying uniforms, rifles, and shoes, but workers struggled with low wages and rising prices. Strikes flared, even as soldiers bled hundreds of miles away. In the South, the economy collapsed. Plantations without enslaved labor faltered. Cotton piled up with no way to export it. Families boiled leather for soup, shredded carpets for clothing. One Confederate diarist wrote simply, "We live on hope and cornbread." And through it all, politics hummed in the background. Lincoln faced re-election in 1864. Many thought he would lose. The war seemed endless, casualties high, victory uncertain. His opponents pushed for peace talks. But then, Union victories, Atlanta, Mobile Bay, shifted the tide. Lincoln won, and with him, the war effort stayed alive. In the Confederacy, Davis grew increasingly unpopular. Critics called him stubborn, dictatorial, even paranoid. By 1865, Confederate newspapers spoke openly of defeat. The home front had lost faith, even before the armies surrendered. But let's drift down from the big picture into smaller lives. A farmer in Pennsylvania, watching armies march across his fields. A mother in Georgia, weaving cloth by candlelight, hoping her son was still alive. An enslaved man in Mississippi, slipping away at night, following rumors of freedom. Ordinary people carried the war in their pockets, their kitchens, their prayers. They endured shortages, fear, taxes, loss. They lived in the shadow of cannons they might never hear, but whose echoes reached them all the same. So what was civilian life during the Civil War? It was riots in city streets. It was bread baked from cornbread and desperation. It was children asking when father was coming home. It was women carrying plows while soldiers carried rifles. It was politics woven into laundry lines and supper tables. War wasn't just fought on fields, it was fought in every house, in every family, every day. Tonight we're pulling up a chair inside the war councils. The candles are flickering, the maps are spread out, and the generals are arguing, because of course they were. Let's start with the Union. The North had the numbers, the factories, the railroads. What they didn't always have, competent leadership, at least not in the beginning. The first few years were a parade of mediocrity. General George McClellan was smart, well-organized, and adored by his men. But he had one glaring flaw: he never wanted to actually fight. He trained his army until they shined like parade soldiers, but when it came time to move, he hesitated, always sure the enemy outnumbered him, always writing letters to Lincoln explaining why he couldn't attack just yet. Lincoln famously sighed, "If General McClellan doesn't want to use the army, perhaps I could borrow it." A very presidential way of saying, please, just do something. McClellan's cautiousness dragged the war out. He missed chances to crush Confederate armies, letting them slip away again and again. Meanwhile, the Confederacy had Robert E. Lee. Now Lee wasn't born a myth, but by the mid-war he became one, dashing, confident, willing to take risks. His men adored him. The South idolized him. He was called Marble Man, though in reality he was just a skilled general who made audacious moves because he had no other choice. The Confederacy had fewer men, fewer resources. Boldness was their only card. Sometimes it worked. Lee's victories at Chancellorsville and Second Bull Run were dazzling. Sometimes, like at Gettysburg, his confidence turned into catastrophe. But Lee wasn't alone. On the Union side, Ulysses S. Grant eventually rose through the ranks, a quiet man with a reputation for being rumpled and unglamorous. He drank, yes, though probably less than the legends claimed. What made him stand out was his relentlessness. He kept pushing. He didn't break after a loss. Grant understood what Lincoln had wanted all along. The Union could afford casualties, the Confederacy couldn't. If Grant kept pressing, no matter the cost, the South would bleed out. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't perfect, but he was persistent, and persistence wins wars. Then there was William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman was intense, brilliant, but unstable. Early in the war, people whispered he was insane. Later, he proved he was just ahead of his time. Sherman saw the war differently. He believed it wasn't just about defeating armies, but about breaking the South's will to fight. That meant targeting railroads, factories, crops, the backbone of the Confederacy. His march to the sea cut through Georgia, leaving a path of destruction. It wasn't random burning. It was deliberate psychological warfare. He wanted Southerners to feel the war in their homes so they'd stop supporting it. Controversial, yes. Effective, definitely. Confederate leadership had its own cast. Stonewall Jackson was Lee's right hand, brilliant, eccentric, deeply religious. He believed God guided his every move. He was also obsessed with lemons, carried them in his pockets, and ate them constantly. Soldiers joked that the secret to his victories was citrus. Jackson's sudden death in 1863 from friendly fire and pneumonia devastated the Confederacy. Lee mourned, "I have lost my right arm," and he wasn't wrong. Without Jackson, Southern strategy stumbled. There was also James Longstreet, Lee's trusted corps commander. Calm, practical, often at odds with Lee's aggressive tendencies. Longstreet argued against the disastrous charge at Gettysburg. History proved him right, but at the time, loyalty meant silence. Leadership in the Civil War wasn't just about strategy, it was about personality. McClellan's vanity, Lee's boldness, Grant's stubbornness, Sherman's vision, Jackson's fanaticism, Longstreet's pragmatism, these weren't abstract traits. They shaped the way battles were fought and how thousands lived or died. But generals didn't operate in a vacuum. They dealt with politics too. Lincoln micromanaged his commanders, reading telegrams at all hours, pushing them forward. Jefferson Davis meddled in Confederate strategy, often clashing with his generals. Every move was second-guessed by newspapers, criticized by congresses. Leadership wasn't just commanding armies, it was surviving constant scrutiny. And yes, generals had egos. They squabbled, undermined one another, chased glory. Some wrote memoirs mid-war, more focused on their legacy than their soldiers. Others froze in the spotlight, paralyzed by fear of failure. And what was it like for the soldiers under these men? Confusing often. One general urged them forward, another ordered them to halt. Victories were celebrated as brilliance, defeats blamed on cowardice. Soldiers grumbled about the high-ups while still marching into battle when told. In letters home, they joked about being moved like chess pieces by men who couldn't see the board. So, leadership in the Civil War. It was a mix of genius and blunders, daring charges and hesitant retreats, men with polished boots who hesitated to use them, and men with muddy uniforms who refused to stop marching. And in the end, it wasn't about brilliance, it was about endurance. The Union could outlast the Confederacy. Grant and Sherman simply embraced that truth sooner than most. By 1865, the Confederacy was running on fumes. Food was gone, supplies were gone, armies were shrinking. Desertion became common, not out of cowardice but necessity. Soldiers slipped away at night, walking home to starving families. One Confederate officer wrote bitterly, "Our men are not whipped, they are simply worn out." Meanwhile, Union forces pressed harder. Grant hammered Lee in Virginia. Sherman marched up from the south, his campaign cutting deeper and deeper into Confederate territory. Railroads were wrecked, plantations abandoned, towns stripped of resources, the walls were closing in. And then came Appomattox. In April 1865, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederacy's strongest force, tried to break west. But Grant's army was everywhere. Trains carrying supplies had been captured, escape routes blocked. Lee knew the end had come. On April 9, Lee met Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The scene was almost quiet. No grand speeches, no shouts of triumph, just two tired generals sitting in a parlor. Lee, still dignified in his gray uniform, sword polished. Grant, mud-stained and wearing a simple private's coat. They talked politely, even warmly. Grant offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers would lay down arms, then go home. Officers could keep their sidearms. Men could take their horses for spring planting. It wasn't humiliation. It was closure. Lee signed. His army surrendered. Outside, Union soldiers cheered. Grant ordered them to stop. "The rebels are our countrymen again," he said. But Appomattox wasn't the very end. Other Confederate forces lingered. Johnston surrendered to Sherman in North Carolina. Kirby Smith in the Trans-Mississippi held out until May. Guerrilla bands scattered even longer. But symbolically, Appomattox was the moment. The Confederacy had collapsed. The costs were staggering. Over 600,000 dead, some say closer to 700,000, more than any other American war combined until the 20th century. Cities in ruins, plantations gutted, families broken, a whole generation scarred. And the wounds weren't just physical. They were political, emotional, cultural. The Union had survived, but at a terrible price. Slavery was dead in law, but the question of freedom's reality, that battle was just beginning. Let's drift back, though, to the smaller, more human moments of surrender. Union and Confederate soldiers mingled at Appomattox. Men who had been trying to kill each other days before now shared rations. Union troops handed over food to half-starved Confederates. One recalled, "We felt sorry for them. They looked like men who had been through hell." Lee rode away slowly, his men weeping as he passed. He told them, "Go home and be good citizens." They listened, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice left. For Union soldiers, victory didn't feel like joy. It felt like relief. The long nightmare was finally ending. And yet, even in that moment of fragile peace, tragedy struck again. Just days after Appomattox, President Lincoln was assassinated. A bullet in Ford's Theater, ending his life before he could guide the country into healing. The nation reeled. Celebrations turned to mourning. The man who had carried the Union through war was gone, leaving Reconstruction to others less capable, less forgiving. The war was over, but peace, that was another story. So what did the end of the Civil War really look like? It wasn't fireworks, it wasn't cheers. It was tired men laying down rifles, shaking hands, and walking home barefoot. It was cities quieting after years of cannon fire. It was silence replacing gunpowder smoke. It was the sound of a country exhaling after holding its breath for 4 long years. The Civil War left scars, but also questions. For the North, it was remembered as a triumph. The Union saved, slavery destroyed, the great test of democracy survived. At least, that's how it was framed in parades and speeches. Lincoln's words, "A new birth of freedom," became almost sacred. Veterans were honored, cemeteries built, monuments rose. But beneath that surface, bitterness lingered. Families divided by loyalty stayed divided for generations. Draft riots, political dissent, and wartime profiteering weren't exactly the stuff of proud memory. So some stories were polished, others quietly forgotten. For the South, memory took a very different shape. Defeat was humiliating, cities burned, slavery abolished. The world they'd built collapsed, but human beings are creative, especially when it comes to memory. Out of that wreckage grew the lost cause, a narrative that said the Confederacy hadn't fought for slavery, but for noble states' rights. That their generals, especially Lee, were near saints. that they'd been defeated only by overwhelming numbers, not because their cause was flawed. This story spread quickly. Southern writers, veterans, widows, they reshaped memory into something less painful, more romantic. Robert E. Lee became marble, almost holy. Stonewall Jackson, a Christian knight. The plantations, recast as peaceful, genteel worlds rather than brutal systems of bondage. It was nostalgia as survival, a way to cope with loss, but it distorted the truth. Meanwhile, African Americans remembered the war very differently. For them, it was liberation, the Emancipation Proclamation, the chance to fight in Union Blue, to carry rifles in defense of freedom. Nearly 200,000 black men served. Their service became a cornerstone of pride and proof that freedom had been earned, not simply given. But memory here was complicated too, because Reconstruction, that fragile chance to build something new, was crushed. White supremacy reasserted itself, violence rose, and so, for many black families, memory of the war was tinged with both triumph and betrayal, a reminder that freedom on paper didn't guarantee justice in reality. Veterans themselves clung to memory in personal ways. Reunions became common, Union and Confederate soldiers shaking hands across stone walls at Gettysburg anniversaries, old men in worn uniforms telling stories that blurred over time. Some recalled horrors, mud, blood, hunger. Others softened the edges, turning the war into a shared boyhood adventure, something less terrifying to look back on. War stories were told at firesides, in letters, in veterans' clubs, sometimes honest, sometimes exaggerated. Memory, after all, is flexible. And then came the monuments. Cemeteries like Arlington rose upon rows of white headstones. Northern cities built statues to Union generals. Southern towns, with help from groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, raised Confederate monuments, often decades later, during the rise of Jim Crow laws. These statues weren't just about memory, they were about politics, about who got to control the story of the war. Literature and art carried memory forward too. Walt Whitman, who had nursed wounded soldiers, wrote poetry that mourned and honored them. Memoirs flooded bookstores. Newspapers serialized dramatic tales of battle. Later, novels like Gone with the Wind romanticized the South, cementing myths that still linger today. Even photography played its role. Images of battlefields, mangled bodies, and weary soldiers brought the war into living rooms. They shaped how later generations imagined it. But memory wasn't just public, it was personal. Widows wearing black for decades, families keeping a faded uniform folded in a trunk, old letters read again and again. Memory lived in homes, not just monuments. Children grew up hearing stories, sometimes of glory, sometimes of grief. And in that way, the war lived on far longer than its 4 years. So what was the legacy of memory? It was fractured. The North celebrated union, the South clung to myth. African Americans remembered liberation, veterans remembered brotherhood or misery or both. Politicians used memory to shape laws, artists used it to shape culture. And as time passed, the edges blurred, myths hardened, truth softened. The Civil War became less about what actually happened and more about how people wanted to remember it. And here's the quiet truth: wars never end, they just echo. In parades, in cemeteries, in textbooks, in arguments. The Civil War echoed through Reconstruction, through segregation, through every later debate about freedom and equality in America. Memory kept it alive, sometimes honestly, sometimes distorted, but always present. Tonight we're not in the camps, or the battlefields, or even the courtrooms. Tonight we're with the men who came home, the veterans, the ones who survived the war only to face the long, uncertain quiet that followed. The Civil War didn't end when surrender was signed. For veterans, it lingered in their bones, their memories, their nightmares. More than 2 million men fought. Hundreds of thousands came home scarred, some wounds visible, others invisible. Let's start with the physical toll. Medicine in the 1860s wasn't modern. Doctors did what they could, but often what they could meant amputation. One bullet in the arm, one shell fragment in the leg, and the sore came out. Ether or chloroform if you were lucky. Whiskey or a bullet to bite if you were. So thousands of veterans came home missing limbs, wooden legs, crude crutches, hooks instead of hands. Families had to adjust. Communities too. Some men couldn't farm anymore, couldn't lift tools, couldn't work the way they once had. And there were no disability benefits, no therapy programs, just perseverance. Some veterans became symbols of endurance. Others, quietly, became beggars on street corners. Then there were the invisible wounds. Soldiers wrote about soldier's heart, a term for anxiety, trembling, depression. Today we'd call it PTSD. But back then, it had no name, no understanding. Men startled at loud noises, woke up screaming, drifted into silence. Letters describe veterans who sat alone on porches for hours, who couldn't work, who drank too much to forget. War didn't leave when they put down their rifles, it followed them home. And then there were the grave. Every community had them. A churchyard lined with headstones, a field turned cemetery, wives became widows, children grew up without fathers. The dead were remembered in hymns, anniversaries, reunions. For veterans, loss wasn't abstract, it was the empty chair at supper. But not all aftermath was bleak. Veterans found each other. They formed groups like the Grand Army of the Republic in the North, a powerful Union veterans organization. They held reunions, parades, gatherings. They lobbied for pensions, for recognition. In the South, Confederate veterans formed their own associations, raising monuments and writing memoirs. These groups gave structure to memory, camaraderie, a sense of purpose, even after the war had stripped them of so much. For African American veterans, the story was different. Freedmen who had served in the Union Army came home proud. They had fought for liberty, for themselves and their families, but respect wasn't guaranteed. Many faced discrimination, violence, exclusion from white veterans groups. Still, they carried their service as proof that freedom had been earned in blood, not just granted. The war also changed families. Women who had managed farms and businesses during the war often continued to do so. Roles had shifted. Some veterans returned to find homes altered, children grown, wives hardened by years of independence. Adjustments weren't easy. Some marriages strained, some collapsed, but others endured, the shared suffering binding families together in quiet resilience. And let's not forget the orphans. Tens of thousands of children lost fathers, orphanages filled. Some children were raised by extended family, others by charitable institutions. For them, the war lived on in absence, in stories told, in pictures kept, in the gap where a parent should have been. Economically, veterans struggled. Jobs weren't waiting, farms were ruined, cities crowded with displaced workers. Some veterans turned to politics, some to business, some drifted. A few became famous, Grant of course, even became president. But the vast majority, they were just men trying to survive in a world that no longer matched the one they'd left. What did life after war really look like? It was a man with a wooden leg hobbling to his fields, a soldier sitting in silence, remembering comrades who didn't come back, old uniforms tucked away in trunks, brought out only for parades, children staring at faded daguerreotypes of fathers they never met. It was struggle, it was survival, it was learning to live with absence. And yet, veterans shaped the country that followed. They became leaders, voters, teachers, laborers. They told stories that shaped how future generations remembered the war. Their scars, physical and emotional, became part of America's fabric. They lived in a country forever changed by the war, even as they tried to carve out ordinary lives in its shadow. So, what did the Civil War look like when it ended? It looked like veterans carrying both pride and pain, like communities stitched together by grief, like a country that celebrated victory, mourned loss, and quietly bore wounds that would never fully heal. The Civil War left scars, but also questions. For the North, it was remembered as a triumph. The Union saved, slavery destroyed, the great test of democracy survived. At least, that's how it was framed in parades and speeches. Lincoln's words, "A new birth of freedom," became almost sacred. Veterans were honored, cemeteries built, monuments rose. But beneath that surface, bitterness lingered. Families divided by loyalties stayed divided for generations. Draft riots, political dissent, and wartime profiteering weren't exactly the stuff of proud memory. So some stories were polished, others quietly forgotten. For the South, memory took a very different shape. Defeat was humiliating, cities burned, slavery abolished. The world they'd built collapsed, but human beings are creative, especially when it comes to memory. Out of that wreckage grew the lost cause, a narrative that said the Confederacy hadn't fought for slavery, but for noble states' rights. That their generals, especially Lee, were near saints. That they'd been defeated only by overwhelming numbers, not because their cause was flawed. This story spread quickly. Southern writers, veterans, widows, they reshaped memory into something less painful, more romantic. Robert E. Lee became marble, almost holy. Stonewall Jackson, a Christian knight. The plantations, recast as peaceful, genteel worlds rather than brutal systems of bondage. It was nostalgia as survival, a way to cope with loss, but it distorted the truth. Meanwhile, African Americans remembered the war very differently. For them, it was liberation, the Emancipation Proclamation, the chance to fight in Union blue, to carry rifles in defense of freedom. Nearly 200,000 black men served. Their service became a cornerstone of pride and proof that freedom had been earned, not simply given. But memory here was complicated too, because Reconstruction, that fragile chance to build something new, was crushed. White supremacy reasserted itself, violence rose. And so, for many black families, memory of the war was tinged with both triumph and betrayal, a reminder that freedom on paper didn't guarantee justice in reality. Veterans themselves clung to memory in personal ways. Reunions became common. Union and Confederate soldiers shaking hands across stone walls at Gettysburg anniversaries. Old men in worn uniforms telling stories that blurred over time. Some recalled horrors, mud, blood, hunger. Others softened the edges, turning the war into a shared boyhood adventure, something less terrifying to look back on. War stories were told at firesides, in letters, in veterans' clubs, sometimes honest, sometimes exaggerated. Memory, after all, is flexible. And then came the monuments. Cemeteries like Arlington rose upon rows of white headstones. Northern cities built statues to Union generals. Southern towns, with help from groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, raised Confederate monuments, often decades later, during the rise of Jim Crow laws. These statues weren't just about memory, they were about politics, about who got to control the story of the war. Literature and art carried memory forward too. Walt Whitman, who had nursed wounded soldiers, wrote poetry that mourned and honored them. Memoirs flooded bookstores. Newspapers serialized dramatic tales of battle. Later, novels like Gone with the Wind romanticized the South, cementing myths that still linger today. Even photography played its role. Images of battlefields, mangled bodies, and weary soldiers brought the war into living rooms. They shaped how later generations imagined it. But memory wasn't just public, it was personal. Widows wearing black for decades, families keeping a faded uniform folded in a trunk, old letters read again and again. Memory lived in homes, not just monuments. Children grew up hearing stories, sometimes of glory, sometimes of grief. And in that way, the war lived on far longer than its 4 years. So, what was the legacy of memory? It was fractured. The North celebrated union, the South clung to myth. African Americans remembered liberation, veterans remembered brotherhood or misery or both. Politicians used memory to shape laws, artists used it to shape culture. And as time passed, the edges blurred, myths hardened, truth softened. The Civil War became less about what actually happened and more about how people wanted to remember it. And here's the quiet truth: wars never end, they just echo. In parades, in cemeteries, in textbooks, in arguments. The Civil War echoed through Reconstruction, through segregation, through every later debate about freedom and equality in America. Memory kept it alive, sometimes honestly, sometimes distorted, but always present. Tonight's the last step on this long march. No uniforms, no muskets, no speeches in Congress, just memory. The Civil War, after all, didn't stay buried with the soldiers. It lingered in cemeteries, in stories, in silence around kitchen tables. Let's start with the most obvious kind of memory: monuments. After the war, statues began to rise. Union generals in northern towns, Confederate memorials in southern squares. Marble soldiers stood watch over courthouse lawns. Each one said something, not just about the past, but about how people wanted to remember it. For the North, it was victory. For the South, often nostalgia, the lost cause myth, polished and romantic. They remembered gallantry, honor, brotherhood. They left out slavery, brutality, defeat. Monuments became history carved in stone, not always accurate, but always deliberate. Then there were the cemeteries. Rows of headstones, Arlington, Gettysburg, Shiloh, places where grass grows thick over ground once red with blood. Families visited, flags were planted, speeches were made. These were sacred spaces, but also political ones, reminders of what had been won and what had been lost. Memory also lived in literature. Veterans wrote memoirs, poets wrote verses. Walt Whitman, who had tended the wounded, wrote about the silent faces of soldiers he saw. Southern writers polished the lost cause. Northern writers celebrated Union triumph. Each book, each line, shaped how later generations understood the war. But memory wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet. In the silence of fathers who never spoke about battle, in the faded photograph kept in a drawer, in the empty place at a holiday table. For many families, the war was not a story but an absence, a wound never quite healed. Communities built rituals around remembrance. Decoration Day, now Memorial Day, began as a way to honor the dead. Women laid flowers on grave, veterans gathered for reunions. Parades filled the streets, not with cheering, but with solemn drums. These acts carried memory forward, year by year, until they became traditions. And then there was politics. How the war was remembered shaped laws, elections, and movements. Reconstruction policies depended on how much blame or forgiveness people were willing to extend. Later, civil rights debates pointed back to the promises made and often broken after the war. Memory wasn't passive, it was active. It shaped the future as much as the past. Generations grew up with different versions of the Civil War. In the South, children were taught about noble generals and brave cavalry charges. In the North, they learned about Lincoln, emancipation, and the Union saved. The war became as much myth as memory, depending on who was telling it. And that's the thing about memory: it changes, it bends, sometimes it distorts. Even today, the Civil War lingers. In debates about flags and statues, in arguments about race and rights, in the way people say heritage or history, meaning very different things. The war ended in 1865, but its echoes haven't gone quiet. So how should we remember it? Maybe not as a story of glory, not as romance, not as tragedy alone, but as a very human story, of ordinary men and women caught in extraordinary times, of mistakes, courage, suffering, stubbornness. A story of a country tearing itself apart, and then trying, haltingly, painfully, to stitch itself back together. And that's where we'll end tonight. The Civil War was fought by farmers, shopkeepers, enslaved men turned soldiers, aristocrats, immigrants, widows, children, people. Their lives were strange, short, long, sad, sometimes absurd, just like ours. And when the guns fell silent, they left behind not just battlefields, but echoes that still reach us even now. So if you're listening in the dark, drifting towards sleep, let the cannons fade. Let the voices of the past quiet down. The war is over, the soldiers are at rest, and all that remains is the long, slow hum of memory. Good night.